Let's start off with the speech that you just made. And you said that the focus on your campaign is going to be reforming the Federal Reserve and making this election about sound money. How do you plan on doing it?
It's a referendum on sound money in the Federal Reserve. That's what I said in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, and I re-emphasized that on the stage today. We're going through economic stagnation in terms of growth. We used to grow at over 4% GDP growth. Now it's less than 1%, less than 1 point something percent GDP growth. Big part of the reason why is the Federal Reserve. It's trying to play financial God, hitting two targets with one arrow, inflation and unemployment. It misses both. So what I've said is I would put the Fed back in its place to have a single mandate. Focus on stabilizing the US dollar as a unit of measurement, period, rather than trying to focus on multiple other mandates. And in the name of smoothing out the business cycle, the Federal Reserve has actually contributed to worsening existing business cycles, creating boom-bust bailout cycles instead. Now, I think that in order to put the Federal Reserve in its place, part of what we need is competition with the dollar itself. That's where Bitcoin and others come in. But I do think it's pretty important to understand the root cause of our economic malady, a root cause of many of the financial crises that we face, is indeed the Federal Reserve itself.
All right, so you would remove the unemployment mandate from the Federal
That's correct.
Reserve and have it focus on the dollar.
Yes.
You mentioned in your speech that you would want to see the dollar again backed by a basket of commodities.
That's correct. So we were on a gold standard until the early 1970s. We had over 4+% GDP growth during that period. We had over 3+% GDP growth, close to 4%, for much of 1980 even to the year 2000, because at least you had a Federal Reserve that was mainly focused on stabilizing the dollar. But in the late 1990s, when the Fed started to take on more aggressively this idea of playing financial God, buying into the Phillips curve and so on, that's when you actually saw a lot of the economic stagnation. And a Fed that's also hostile to wage growth in America. So anytime wages go up, they automatically tighten monetary policy, which is a big part of the reason why the bottom 99% has not gotten ahead in this country over the course of the last 20 years. So I think the right answer is not necessarily to go back to the gold standard, but more precisely to go to a gold-like standard, which is a basket of commodities that include farm commodities, gold, silver, nickel, etc., but a wide basket of commodities that prevent the dollar itself from being volatile, but also actually holds up the integrity of the dollar itself.
That would mean that the ability of the Fed to print would be curtailed. That's why we got off the gold standard in the first place, because Nixon wanted to allow the country to be able to print more money. Do you think that there would be cooperation with something like that essentially takes away the ability to print? I mean, we're seeing gridlock when it comes to raising the debt ceiling. Imagine the kind of gridlock you would face and resistance when it comes to curtailing the U.S. Federal Reserve's and Congress's ability to print money.
Well, the thing I would say now is this, at least we have going for us, is this should not be a partisan issue. It is not inherently a partisan issue. Not a Republican issue, a Democrat issue. I think Republicans generally do care about economic growth. At least we have for most of our history as a party. They don't talk about it much anymore. I'm bringing it to the fore. Democrats, for their part, talk a lot about economic inequality and wage stagnation. The Federal Reserve is directly responsible for real wage stagnation in this country because they're hostile to wage increases. Whenever wages go up, they treat that as a leading indicator of inflation. As a side note, it's actually a trailing indicator of a business cycle, when in fact that means they tighten monetary policy into an already existing downturn in the business cycle that contributes to actually creating a bust, worsening the business cycle in the name of helping it. So I think there's something in it for both Republicans and Democrats. I think the key is actually explaining that, understanding why Democrats want more economic mobility for the 99%. Great, getting the Federal Reserve out of the way is a big part of achieving that goal. Republicans want economic growth. Well, if the dollar's stable, you actually have greater economic growth because dollars track capital, the capital tracks projects more effectively and more efficiently when the dollar isn't wildly fluctuating. So I'm optimistic that there's enough in this of common cause such that this doesn't have to be a Democrat versus Republican issue. I also think there's things the president can do even without Congress. So yes, we would need formally to change back to a single mandate. We're going to need congressional action. But part of what the president does with the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve is we have the removal power. So I'll take over in January of 2025. By 2026, we have an appointment power for who occupies the seat of that U.S. Federal Reserve. My view is it should be somebody who shares my perspective here, in the tradition of former Vice Chairman Manley Johnson, pick the right person. That's another way the president, without asking Congress, can actually help reform the Fed.
But what would involve getting the dollar backed by a basket of commodities?
What would it involve?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple. Just like when we had a gold standard, you have the Federal Reserve's ability to either buy back or sell dollars in a manner that ties it to what that basket is in a very narrow band that reduces the volatility to no more than what that basket of commodities is volatile at as well. And if it's a diversified enough basket of commodities, that would not be a volatile dollar.